At 6:47 a.m. on August 14, 1943, Corporal Daniel Harlow lay flat against the soaked jungle floor on New Georgia, his cheek pressed into cold mud, breath fogging softly in the morning humidity. The canopy overhead was still dim, the first sunlight barely slicing through the thick leaves. Everything smelled of wet earth, gun oil, and rotting vegetation. Then, a single rifle crack split the silence. A splinter of bark snapped off the tree trunk inches above his helmet. Japanese sniper. Harlow didn't flinch. He stayed frozen exactly as the jungle demanded. Belly down, elbows buried in the soil, his M1 Carbine tucked tight into his shoulder. He squeezed off one blind, suppressive shot. The muzzle flash lit the dark undergrowth for a heartbeat, just like every Pacific veteran remembered it. Bright fire, black shadows, drifting smoke. His platoon was pinned. 10 men scattered behind roots and fallen logs, too terrified to lift their heads. Every shift, every breath, every rustle of gear triggered another shot from somewhere up in the tree line. High angle, clean, disciplined. Japanese snipers didn't miss twice. A sergeant whispered harshly through the brush. "They're above us 30, maybe 40 yards up. Can't see a damn thing." Another round sliced clean through a fern beside Harlow's left arm. He knew the doctrine. Army manuals preach stance, steady breathing, clear sight picture, firing from kneeling or standing. None of that mattered here. The ground was swampy, the angles steep, the light uneven. The M1 Carbine shook with every heartbeat, its lightweight barrel drifting when aiming uphill through layers of vines and branches. And the worst part? They had banned the only thing that gave him control. 2 weeks earlier, he had shown up at morning inspection with a strange modification, a carved wooden fence post stabilizer he'd fashioned from a broken crate in the supply tent. His idea was brutally simple. Add forward mass, anchor the rifle into the dirt or a tree root, and eliminate the micro-shake that ruined accuracy in jungle fighting. His squad laughed at him. His lieutenants scolded him. The company armorer wrote it up as unsafe, unauthorized, structurally unsound. The order was short and humiliating. "Remove it. That thing's not leaving the wire. There's a looter." That was a video event. Now, on a muddy hillside in the Solomon Islands with 3 Japanese snipers hunting them from the canopy, Harlow pressed his face deeper into the earth. The manual wasn't going to save him. Neither were the men around him. Everyone was pinned down, waiting for the next shot to find a skull instead of a tree. And in the next hour, that banned piece of lumber wood. The sun finally pushed above the eastern ridge at 6:59 a.m., casting weak golden streaks across the tangled jungle floor that Corporal Harlow and his platoon had been crawling through since before dawn. The air hung thick with humidity that clung to their uniforms like a second skin, making every movement heavy and deliberate as they struggled to keep their rifles dry in the dripping undergrowth. They had been advancing along a narrow ridge trail overlooking the Munda Point airfield, a strategic lifeline the brass needed secured before the next wave of Japanese reinforcements could land along the coast. The terrain here was a miserable mix of slick mud, rotting leaves, and jagged roots that forced every man to crouch unnaturally low while trying to maintain a coherent formation in the labyrinth of vines. The ridge itself was barely wide enough for 2 men to crawl side by side, and the slope to their right dropped sharply into a ravine filled with thick brush that concealed anything from wandering patrols to concealed sniper nests. Every few seconds, a soft rustling noise drifted upward from that ravine, blending with the steady hum of insects and the distant rumble of surf rolling against the southern beaches. Harlow listened carefully and could distinguish at least 2 different sets of birds scattering in short bursts, a sign that something had moved through the foliage below them. The sergeant signaled for everyone to hold position, raising his fist slowly as he leaned into the trunk of a moss-covered palm tree that had clearly taken fire earlier, its bark scarred by half a dozen clean bullet strikes. Farther up the line, a radio man fought with the static chewing through his handset, trying to reach the battalion command post on the western side of the ridge where the rest of their company had dug in. The signal was weak and broken by heavy interference that made every instruction sound like wind blowing across a microphone. Harlow could hear the frustration in the radio man's breathing as he whispered into the microphone, trying to confirm whether friendly mortar fire would be available if they made visual contact with the shooters in the trees. The answer never came clearly enough to trust, leaving the entire squad uncertain whether support was even possible in this thick terrain. To their left, the ridge curved into a shallow saddle where the jungle grew even denser. the canopy merging overhead into a single ceiling of interlocking branches that blocked almost all remaining sunlight. The darkness under that canopy felt oppressive, a heavy curtain of shadow that seemed designed to hide the glint of a sniper's scope or the faint motion of a camouflaged helmet. Harlow felt the same familiar tension building in his chest as he stared into the shadowed tree line, knowing the Japanese marksmen were patient and preferred to fire only when a target settled long enough for a clean shot. The platoon had already lost one scout earlier that morning, and his absence left a noticeable gap in their forward security that made every man acutely aware of how vulnerable they had become. The sergeant finally crawled back toward Harlow. His voice kept low as he explained that the platoon had drifted farther south than intended during the night movement, placing them closer to the enemy's fallback route than the battalion realized. This meant the Japanese sniper team they were facing now was likely covering a retreating element, which explained their precision and discipline in maintaining pressure from above without exposing themselves. Harlow understood immediately that they had stumbled onto a piece of ground the enemy couldn't afford to lose, and this realization tightened the sense of urgency that had been building since the first shot rang out earlier that morning. The ridge was no longer just another waypoint in a slow advance through the jungle. It was the hinge point between their unit's movement and the Japanese defense, and every second spent pinned here gave the enemy more time to reposition or reinforce. As another round cracked overhead and plucked a leaf from the branch above his helmet, Harlow steadied his breathing and studied the tree line with renewed intensity, knowing the next decision they made on this ridge could determine whether his platoon continued forward or never left this jungle at all. The ridge erupted into sudden chaos as another burst of rifle fire tore through the branches above them, sending fragments of wood and leaves raining down on the platoon, while men flattened themselves instinctively against the soaked ground. The sergeant shouted for everyone to keep their heads down, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to project calm authority over the rising panic that rippled through the line. One of the newer privates struggled to control his breathing as he pressed himself into the earth, whispering rapidly that he could hear at least two shooters adjusting positions somewhere along the upper canopy, just beyond their field of view. A sharp metallic clang echoed from Harlow's right as the assistant automatic rifleman accidentally bumped his weapon against a tree root, drawing a fresh crack from a Japanese marksman, who almost certainly mistook the sound for a repositioning attempt. The bullet snapped past so close that Harlow felt the air ripple along his cheek, a reminder that the enemy had a near-perfect angle from the tree line. The platoon medic cursed under his breath while dragging a wounded rifleman behind a thicker tree trunk, the injured man clutching his forearm where a splintered round had grazed him moments earlier. The medic worked with quick, practiced movements, but even he kept glancing nervously at the canopy, as if expecting a shot to drop directly into his exposed back at any second. The radio man finally managed to get a partial transmission through the static, only to hear command tell them that artillery support was still offline due to misaligned spotting coordinates, forcing the platoon to endure the sniper fire without any external help. The sergeant clenched his jaw in frustration, knowing that moving forward was suicidal and pulling back down the ridge would expose them to an even steeper angle from the Japanese shooters. He tried to count the enemy rifles by sound alone, estimating at least 3 distinct firing positions, separated by enough distance to create overlapping kill zones that made any attempt at flanking nearly impossible. Harlow shifted his weight carefully, feeling the mud cling to his uniform as he studied the ridge through a narrow gap in the leaves directly ahead of him. Every instinct told him the snipers were using the natural curvature of the canopy to mask their silhouettes, firing downward through small openings that provided clean sightlines without exposing their positions. The jungle seemed to pulse around them, alive with the echoes of distant birds, the soft drip of water from high branches, and the constant tension of men trying not to breathe too loudly. One misplaced sound could draw another lethal shot, and everyone knew it. A corporal near the front attempted to crawl toward a better position, but the moment he lifted his shoulder, more than a few inches off the ground, a round smashed into the dirt beside his hand, forcing him to freeze in place with his face inches from a nest of fire ants. He trembled but remained still, understanding that the snipers were not firing blindly, but rather waiting for any sign of upward motion that suggested a man was attempting to find cover or locate a shooter. Behind him, another private muttered angrily that the Japanese must have been tracking them since dawn, using sound and movement to guide their fire with unnerving precision. The sergeant finally ordered everyone to stay completely prone, emphasizing that any attempt to return fire without a clear visual would only waste ammunition and give away their best remaining concealment. Harlow listened to the command but felt a growing knot tighten in his stomach, because he knew their current position was unsustainable, and that remaining pinned on the ridge would eventually invite a flanking maneuver from Japanese infantry trailing behind the snipers. The longer they stayed here, the worse their chances became, as the forest settled into a tense, oppressive silence broken only by the occasional distant call of a bird. Harlow could sense the morale of the platoon slipping with every passing minute. The chaos around him was not the loud, frantic kind found in open firefights, but a suffocating, psychological pressure where every rustle of a leaf or crack of a branch felt like an omen of another precise shot from the trees. In that tightening vice of fear and uncertainty, Harlow began to realize that the only way out might require ignoring every line of doctrine he had ever been taught and relying instead on the banned idea he'd been forced to abandon 2 weeks earlier. The Army manuals that Corporal Harlow had studied back in California made the M1 Carbine sound like a model of straightforward efficiency, describing it as a lightweight, fast-handling rifle best used in open terrain, where clear sight lines allowed a soldier to maintain textbook form. The training instructors had drilled the same sequence into every recruit, with repetitive insistence, emphasizing that proper stance and stable breathing mattered more than raw power when engaging targets within the carbine's optimal range. Each soldier was taught to begin from a balanced kneeling or standing position, draw the buttstock tightly into the shoulder pocket, and align the rear aperture with the front sight post in one smooth, uninterrupted motion. During qualification sessions, the instructors walked behind the firing line, correcting elbow placement, adjusting foot angles, and repeating the mantra that accuracy depended on consistency and muscle memory rather than improvisation or brute force. Every reload began with the same deliberate steps. Pull the charging handle firmly, guide the magazine into the well with a clean upward motion, and check the chamber before settling back into the firing stance. The manual insisted that any deviation from the sequence risked inducing unnecessary recoil, drift, or sight misalignment that could throw a shot wide even at modest distances. Those lessons worked flawlessly on the dry, flat ranges where the horizon was sharp and stationary silhouettes stood still against predictable backdrops. Out there, with no vines tugging at a soldier's sleeves or mud sucking at his knees, the carbine truly was the nimble little rifle the Army advertised. The instructors had demonstrated how quickly a trained shooter could snap off shots in rhythm, using controlled breaths to keep the sights centered and stable throughout rapid engagements. They emphasized that the carbine's light recoil allowed soldiers to reacquire their sight picture almost immediately, enabling them to place accurate rounds on target faster than most enemies could react. However, none of those carefully rehearsed movements translated into the harsh reality of the New Georgia jungle, where the ground tilted unpredictably under a soldier's weight, and every branch seemed designed to disrupt even the simplest firing posture. The manuals never mentioned how difficult it was to maintain a proper stance while lying in a pool of stagnant water, or how impossible it felt to keep the front sight steady when aiming sharply upward through dense vines. Harlow remembered an instructor proudly stating that the carbine's design allowed it to be fired from any position, but he doubted that instructor had ever tried shooting from a hillside where the earth shifted with every breath. The doctrine also assumed that targets would appear at chest height or slightly above, not 30 or 40 yards overhead where shadows blended into each other and snipers used gravity itself to their advantage. The standard method for scanning the horizon-wide arcs from left to right became worthless when the threat came from above, forcing every man on the ridge to twist his neck into uncomfortable angles while trying to maintain a stable firing platform. The manual had never accounted for the way tropical humidity made the carbine's wooden stock slick, or how insects swarmed a shooter's face the moment he tried to settle into a long hold. Harlow had always respected the training and understood its value, but he couldn't ignore how the rigid doctrine left no room for adaptation in a place where the terrain broke every rule written in those neatly printed pages. As he lay half-submerged in the muddy slope with sniper rounds slicing overhead, he felt the widening gap between textbook instructions and battlefield necessity tighten around his platoon like a vice. The carbine might have been engineered for speed and maneuverability, yet here on this unforgiving ridge, it felt like a tool built for a different world entirely, one far cleaner, flatter, and simpler than the jungle swallowing them now. And as he steadied his breathing, Harlow began to understand that surviving the next hour would require abandoning every lesson the manual had ever taught him. The deeper Harlow pressed himself into the mud, the more painfully obvious it became that the training manuals had never accounted for the unpredictable geometry of jungle combat, where every slope forced the body into contorted positions that stripped a rifleman of the stability those doctrines relied upon. Aiming upward through the canopy demanded an unnatural bend in the spine, twisting his ribs just enough to disrupt the controlled breathing that the instructors had sworn was essential for steady marksmanship. Even the slightest shift in weight caused the slick ground to slide beneath him, making the carbine's lightweight frame wobble in ways that no amount of discipline could fully counteract. The air itself worked against him, thick with moisture that fogged his rear aperture and left beads of condensation forming on the sight post, turning each shot into a gamble between timing and visibility. When he tried to wipe the moisture away, he felt the ground tremble slightly under his elbow, a reminder that the hillside remained unstable and could collapse into the ravine with just a few careless movements. The jungle vegetation added another layer of unpredictability, with broad leaves brushing against his cheek and long vines tugging at the barrel as he tried to line up a shot through the shifting shadows above him. The manual's insistence on clean sight alignment meant little when the sniper nest he was trying to pinpoint was hidden behind intersecting layers of foliage that shifted with every passing breeze, creating dozens of false silhouettes that made identifying a true target nearly impossible. Harlow knew the Japanese marksmen were using small gaps in the canopy to fire downward, taking advantage of the natural funnel created by the ridge's shape to send rounds into the most likely positions of the pinned platoon. The carbine's short barrel, normally an asset in tight spaces, struggled to maintain a stable aim at the upward angle required to punch through the canopy without deflecting off unseen branches. Every attempt Harlow made to adjust his grip only highlighted another flaw that the textbooks ignored. The carbine's center of balance sat too close to the receiver, making it front light and prone to subtle muzzle wobble when unsupported by firm ground. The instructors had boasted that the weapon's agility made it perfect for aggressive movement, yet that advantage turned into a disadvantage when stillness and precision were the only paths to survival. The more he tried to hold the rifle steady, the more acutely he felt the faint tremors in his forearm caused by exhaustion, adrenaline, and the awkward angle of his prone position. Compounding the technical issues was the psychological strain of being unable to see the enemy, a gap between doctrine and reality that the Army's neatly printed diagrams never addressed. The manuals treated snipers as static threats that could be countered with coordinated fire and superior numbers. But here, the Japanese marksmen moved silently through the high branches, repositioning after each shot to maintain total dominance over the ridge. Their fire wasn't simply accurate, it was calculated to exploit every weakness in American posture and equipment, leaving the platoon trapped in a situation where conventional firing techniques offered no meaningful solution. What troubled Harlow most was the growing awareness that his platoon lacked any stable resting point for their rifles, preventing them from compensating for the carbine's inherent tendency to drift when aimed upward for extended periods. He remembered how the instructors had dismissed field expedients as unnecessary or unsafe, insisting that the carbine needed only disciplined technique to perform effectively in all environments. Yet here, in the steaming chaos of the Solomon Islands jungle, discipline alone was failing every one of them as the snipers maintained complete control of the engagement. As another shot cracked through the upper branches and forced him to bury his face deeper into the mud, Harlow felt the creeping certainty that the problem wasn't his nerves or technique, but the simple physics of a lightweight rifle in unstable terrain. The manual's rigid doctrine could not overcome the jungle's geometry, and without a new point of stability, no amount of training would allow them to challenge the snipers dominating the canopy above. In that moment, he realized that surviving the next hour would require abandoning the comfortable truths of instruction and embracing a solution the Army had explicitly forbidden, one that he alone understood well enough to attempt. Before the war pushed him into the steaming jungles of the Pacific, Corporal Daniel Harlow had lived a quiet and unremarkable life in the foothills outside Redding, California, where he spent most of his days hauling lumber, repairing fences, and helping his father maintain the small ranch that had been in the family for 3 generations. His hands had toughened early from years of gripping wooden posts and hammering nails through warped planks, and he developed a natural instinct for understanding how different pieces of wood behaved under pressure or weight. That skill, unnoticed by most people around him, would later prove far more valuable on the battlefield than any rifle qualification score printed in his training file. Harlow had never dreamed of becoming a soldier, or imagined himself fighting across distant islands whose names he could barely pronounce. But the attack on Pearl Harbor changed the quiet rhythm of his life in a single afternoon, pulling him into a world of uniforms, drills, and long marches beneath an unfamiliar sun. Though he learned quickly and adapted well during basic training, he always felt slightly out of place among the more athletic or ambitious recruits who treated competition as the natural language of manhood. What set him apart wasn't speed or strength, but his almost stubborn patience, a trait shaped by years of working outdoors where tasks were completed slowly, methodically, and with respect for the materials at hand. During marksmanship training, the instructors immediately noticed that Harlow was neither exceptionally gifted nor particularly clumsy with a rifle. He simply worked through each step with the quiet focus of a man who preferred precision over flair. He didn't celebrate when he qualified, and didn't sulk when he missed a shot, instead studying the subtle shift of his front sight or the tension in his grip to understand why the round drifted. His steady temperament made him dependable, and his natural curiosity about how things functioned, whether a rifle mechanism or a field tool, often led him to spend evenings tinkering with whatever spare parts he could find in the workshop behind the barracks. The other recruits teased him for being the ranch carpenter or the fence guy, nicknames rooted more in friendly amusement than cruelty. But those jokes solidified his reputation as the quiet handyman who could repair anything that broke. When a soldier's canteen strap snapped during a night exercise, Harlow fixed it using a small wooden dowel he shaved from a fallen branch, impressing even the drill sergeant who had originally mocked his rural background. That incident marked the first time the platoon recognized that Harlow's practical skills weren't simply rustic oddities, but useful assets in a military environment where gear frequently failed under stress. Once deployed to the Solomons, those skills became even more important as the unforgiving environment destroyed equipment faster than the quartermasters could replace it. Harlow built improvised tent pegs during storms, reinforced weakened crates with scavenged planks, and repaired splintered rifle stocks using strips of bamboo and field rations tape. His resourcefulness earned him the unofficial role of platoon fixer, a man others sought out when something essential needed a quick and reliable solution. Yet for all his usefulness, he never saw himself as particularly brave or exceptional. He simply didn't like seeing things break when he knew they could be repaired. What his squad didn't fully appreciate was how deeply Harlow understood the relationship between stability and force, a knowledge shaped by long days of setting fence posts in stubborn soil, where each angle mattered more than sheer strength. That intuitive understanding lingered in the back of his mind throughout his first weeks in the jungle, resurfacing whenever he felt the carbine's front end drift upward during high-angle shots. To him, the rifle's instability wasn't a mystery or a flaw in his technique, but a simple physical problem lacking an adequate support structure, a realization that eventually led him toward the controversial idea that would earn him ridicule from his lieutenant. As the ridge fight grew more desperate, and every missed shot carried the weight of another man's survival, Harlow's memories of the ranch blended with the harsh lessons of combat, forming a single conviction that refused to be ignored. He wasn't a natural marksman, nor a fearless hero, nor a soldier chasing glory. He was a builder who knew how to make things steadier, stronger, and more reliable. And in that jungle, with snipers controlling every inch of elevation, he understood with absolute clarity that the only way for his platoon to survive depended on applying that same simple principle, no matter how many officers had dismissed it as foolish. The idea first took shape on a rain-soaked afternoon 2 weeks earlier, when Harlow crouched beside the supply tent, repairing a cracked ammunition crate that had split under the weight of a rushed airdrop. As he shaved down a warped plank to replace the broken slat, he noticed how the thick piece of wood felt surprisingly comfortable beneath the weight of his forearm, creating a natural brace that steadied his wrist far more effectively than the slippery soil they usually fought on. The realization struck him with a quiet clarity that felt almost embarrassingly simple, yet undeniably true. A rifle needed a stable point of contact just as much as a fence post needed solid ground to stand upright. The more he considered it, the more the jungle's geometry made sense through that familiar logic, revealing the same structural principles he had learned from years of setting posts across uneven ranch fields. A longer, heavier forward support could counteract the carbine's tendency to drift when angled upward, allowing him to direct force into the ground, rather than fighting gravity with exhausted muscles alone. By the time he finished repairing the crate, he had already selected a sturdy piece of wood, roughly 20 inches long, that he believed could transform the carbine into a far steadier tool for the kind of high-angle shooting their battles demanded. Back in the perimeter that evening, he worked quietly beside his foxhole, shaping the plank with a field knife and smoothing its edges with the concentration of a craftsman rather than a soldier preparing for combat. He drilled small notches along one side so the wood could press flush against the carbine's handguard, then secured it with leather straps salvaged from a damaged canteen harness. The resulting contraption looked crude and improvised, yet its weight distribution felt perfect when he rested the rifle on a tree root, creating a stable contact point that reduced the jitter in his sight picture by an amount he could feel instantly and unmistakably. When his squad mates noticed the strange extension attached to his rifle the next morning, their reactions ranged from puzzled amusement to outright laughter, with one private joking that Harlow had finally lost his mind after spending too many nights staring at rotting palm trunks. Another soldier compared the thing to a barnyard crutch, prompting a round of snickers that carried across the camp as men gathered around to inspect the odd invention. Harlow accepted the teasing with a patient half-smile, understanding that few people appreciated ideas that didn't originate in an official manual or come stamped with the Army's approval. The lieutenant, however, was far less amused. After examining the modification with a disapproving frown, he declared it unsafe, unauthorized, and structurally questionable, insisting that adding weight to the carbine's forward end violated maintenance regulations and posed unnecessary risks during rapid engagements. He delivered his reprimand in front of the entire platoon, ensuring the message was clear. No experimental attachments, no field-made gadgets, and no deviations from standard doctrine. Harlow was ordered to remove the stabilizer immediately, and the lieutenant punctuated his command with the familiar phrase every creative soldier eventually heard: "Your job is to shoot, not redesign Army equipment." Despite the public embarrassment, Harlow couldn't shake the certainty that the device worked, because during a brief test behind the wire, he had seen how dramatically it improved his ability to hold the rifle steady when firing uphill. The stabilizer didn't transform him into a marksman, nor did it magically sharpen his eyesight, but it provided something far more valuable in the jungle: predictable control in a world where nothing stayed still. He kept the carved plank tucked inside his pack, even after being ordered to discard it, telling himself he would only use it if circumstances became desperate enough to outweigh the risk of disobeying a direct instruction. As the memory of those moments echoed through his mind on the mud-soaked ridge, with Japanese snipers tightening their grip from above, Harlow understood that the idea everyone had laughed at might be the only thing capable of shifting the balance. The fence post carbine, once ridiculed and forbidden, now waited quietly in his pack, its simple weight offering the promise of stability in a battlefield where every other certainty had already collapsed. The stabilizer made sense to Harlow, not because of anything he had learned in the Army, but because the principles behind it mirrored the logic he had lived by since childhood, where solving physical problems meant understanding how structure interacted with force, rather than memorizing the rigid steps of a training manual. When he attached the wooden post beneath the carbine, he was essentially shifting the weapon's center of mass forward, creating a longer moment arm that resisted minor tremors in his hands, and transformed the rifle's natural tendency to wobble into a slower, more predictable movement that he could control with far less effort. The extra weight acted like the counterbalance on a fence auger, letting gravity do the work that his tired muscles could no longer sustain, especially when firing from steep angles that demanded unnatural posture. He also understood intuitively that the jungle amplified every instability, because aiming upward meant the slightest twitch traveled a greater visual distance across the canopy, making small mistakes appear enormous through the rear aperture. The stabilizer minimized that effect by anchoring the forward end of the rifle to the ground or a tree root, ensuring the sight picture moved in a tight, controlled arc rather than shifting erratically with every heartbeat. This grounding effect created a pseudo-bipod, one that didn't rely on delicate metal legs or formal engineering, but instead used the raw leverage of a solid wooden beam pressed into the earth. It wasn't elegant, but it obeyed the same physics that allowed him to hold a post steady while driving nails through the top slat of a fence. The Army instructors preached that the carbine's light weight made it ideal for rapid movement, yet that same characteristic became a liability when a soldier was forced to hold the barrel elevated for extended periods while searching for targets hidden in high foliage. By adding the stabilizer, Harlow effectively turned the rifle into a more rigid lever, allowing the muscles in his shoulders and back to relax slightly as the post absorbed the downward pressure and redistributed it into the ground. This simple shift reduced fatigue and increased the amount of time he could maintain a stable sight picture, a critical advantage in a sniper engagement where seconds of stillness could make the difference between life and death. Another overlooked benefit came from the way the wooden post acted as a dampening device, absorbing the micro-vibrations that traveled through the carbine's stock whenever he shifted his weight or adjusted his cheek weld. Without the stabilizer, those vibrations traveled directly into the muzzle, disrupting the rifle's orientation just enough to throw shots off course when aiming at distant or partially concealed targets. With the post in place, the vibrations dissipated harmlessly into the ground before reaching the barrel, giving him a level of precision that felt almost impossible with the carbine's original configuration. Harlow also noticed that the added length beneath the rifle created a natural visual reference when scanning for targets, helping him maintain consistent elevation and angle as he moved his line of sight across the canopy. The stabilizer acted like a carpenter's guide rail, offering a physical marker that prevented him from overcorrecting as he tracked slight movements within the dense shadows overhead. This subtle improvement allowed him to anticipate where a sniper might shift positions, aligning his sights with greater efficiency and reducing the likelihood of losing the target amidst the constantly shifting patterns of light. While the lieutenant had dismissed the mod as unnecessary and unsafe, Harlow recognized that its true strength lay not in sophistication but in its adaptability, because it allowed him to respond to the jungle's chaotic geometry with a tool tailored specifically to its demands. The stabilizer required no delicate machining, no specialized parts, and no maintenance beyond occasionally tightening the leather straps. It simply used mass, leverage, and contact, three things the jungle provided in abundance. And as he studied the tree line under the relentless pressure of enemy fire, he realized that the mod didn't just improve his aim, it fundamentally redefined how the carbine interacted with the terrain. Lying there with mud seeping through his sleeves and sniper rounds cutting through the branches above him, Harlow could feel the quiet confidence that came from understanding the physics behind his invention, a certainty born not of ego, but of experience. The fence post carbine wasn't a gimmick or a desperate improvisation. It was a natural extension of everything he had learned working the ranch. A device built from instinct and necessity that solved a problem the army didn't even realize existed. And now, trapped beneath a canopy controlled by enemy marksmen, that simple piece of wood might be the only thing capable of turning the fight in their favor. Harlow's first real chance to test the stabilizer had come 3 days before the ridge fight, during a brief patrol along a shallow ravine where the canopy thinned just enough to allow scattered patches of sunlight to reach the forest floor. The squad had been moving cautiously through the twisting undergrowth when a sudden burst of rifle fire erupted from a cluster of banyan roots on the opposite slope, forcing the men to drop instantly into the nearest cover while scrambling to understand the direction of the attack. The jungle amplified the echoes in unpredictable ways, making the sniper's position difficult to pinpoint, yet something about the angle of impact convinced Harlow that the shot had come from a narrow perch halfway up the opposite ridge. As the squad attempted to spread out and locate the shooter, Harlow noticed the same familiar tremor in the carbine's forward end, a slight but frustrating drift that made precise aiming nearly impossible in the humid, uneven terrain. His instincts urged him to reach for the stabilizer he had kept hidden inside his pack, and after a quiet glance at the distracted sergeant, he slid the wooden post free with deliberate care. The plank felt reassuring in his hands, its weight grounding him with the calm confidence of a tool he understood better than any piece of army equipment he carried. With one smooth motion, he secured it against the handguard using the worn leather straps he had tightened the night before, ensuring the fit was snug without creaking. He crawled forward until he found a shallow depression between two exposed roots, then eased the stabilizer into the soft soil, allowing the rifle to settle into a position that felt instantly more stable than anything he had experienced since arriving in the Solomons. The muzzle no longer drifted unpredictably, and the rear aperture aligned with a steadiness he had never achieved in the jungle, making the entire rifle feel like an extension of the earth beneath him. Through the shifting branches across the ravine, he spotted a faint movement just the edge of a helmet dipping behind a cluster of vines, and his breath slowed to a deliberate rhythm as he prepared the shot. The sniper fired again, his muzzle flash barely visible through the foliage, but the sound confirmed the angle Harlow had been tracking. Harlow exhaled gently, letting the stabilizer absorb the tension in his shoulders while he corrected the sight picture by the smallest margin, feeling the rifle respond with a calm precision the unmodified carbine had never allowed. When he squeezed the trigger, the shot cracked across the ravine with a clean, confident tone that surprised even him, followed by a muffled rustle that suggested the enemy marksman had been caught off guard. The squad glanced toward Harlow with a mix of confusion and admiration, though no one immediately understood how he had managed to spot and neutralize a sniper whose firing position had eluded everyone else. The sergeant crawled beside him, studying the angle of the shot before noticing the unfamiliar length of wood strapped beneath the carbine. His expression shifted from impressed to irritated, as he realized Harlow had reinstated the forbidden modification. But the weight of the moment softened his reaction, leaving him unable to fully reprimand a device that had just saved the patrol from a dangerous ambush. Despite the sergeant's stern reminder that the stabilizer remained unauthorized, Harlow sensed a quiet respect lingering behind the officer's tone, a subtle acknowledgement that the crude invention had delivered results when standard doctrine had failed. None of the men spoke openly about the shot as they resumed the patrol, yet their occasional sidelong glances told Harlow everything he needed to know. They trusted the mod, even if they weren't ready to admit it aloud. The brief encounter faded quickly into the endless rhythm of jungle marching, but its significance burned firmly into his memory. The stabilizer worked not just in theory, but in practice, under pressure, in real combat. Now, pinned on the ridge under far heavier fire, Harlow remembered that moment with a surge of clarity, understanding that the test had not been an anomaly or stroke of luck, it had been proof. And proof was enough to justify breaking orders when the survival of an entire platoon hung in the balance. The breaking point arrived swiftly and without warning when a sharp, echoing volley sliced through the branches above the platoon, sending splintered fragments of wood raining across the ridge as two men cried out for cover with voices trembling from fear rather than injury. The Japanese snipers had shifted positions again, tightening their angle and firing with a rhythm that suggested they were preparing to close in, using relentless pressure to force the Americans into desperation before launching a coordinated assault from the flanks. The sergeant crawled along the line with barely controlled urgency, whispering that their right side was beginning to fold inward because the slope offered almost no protection against the high-angle shots funneling down from the canopy. Harlow felt the tension building like a physical weight across his chest as the reality of their situation became painfully clear. They were caught on a ridge that favored the enemy in every conceivable way, pinned beneath marksmen who understood the terrain better than any American map could ever capture. Every man in the platoon pressed flatter against the ground, afraid to raise even an elbow, knowing the Japanese were adjusting their range with ruthless precision. A private near Harlow whispered that he had seen at least one muzzle flash from a branch 30 feet overhead, meaning the snipers were using the upper limbs as firing platforms rather than staying on the ground where American doctrine expected them to operate. The medic's quiet curse confirmed that another soldier had been grazed, and though the wound was minor, the psychological blow was severe because it demonstrated that the enemy could hit them even when fully prone. Harlow watched the sergeant's face pale as he realized they could not remain in this position much longer without suffering catastrophic losses, and the unspoken fear settled across the platoon like a cold fog. Retreating down the ridge would expose them completely, while pushing forward into thicker brush risked walking directly into an unseen kill zone, prepared by the same snipers who already controlled the high ground. For several agonizing seconds, the jungle fell eerily silent, broken only by distant birds and the faint drip of water falling from the canopy, an unnatural pause that signaled the snipers were repositioning for another coordinated burst. Harlow's heartbeat accelerated as he recalled the brief success of his stabilizer during the earlier patrol, the quiet confidence he'd felt when the rifle had finally responded with the steadiness he'd always known it could achieve. He reached slowly toward his pack, fingers brushing the familiar leather straps that held the wooden post in place, feeling the grain of the carved surface beneath his thumb. No officer was watching him closely enough to intervene, and even if someone noticed, he suspected the lieutenant would think twice before stopping the only soldier on the ridge with a viable plan. When the next shot cracked through the canopy, it struck the ground so close to Harlow's left arm that he felt the grit bounce against his skin, a visceral reminder that hesitation would only invite death. He drew the stabilizer from his pack with careful, deliberate movements, ensuring the sound of shifting wood was masked by the platoon's collective breathing and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. The weight of the post steadied his nerves, grounding him in the certainty that he was making the only rational decision available in a situation spiraling rapidly toward disaster. As he secured the stabilizer beneath the carbine with practiced efficiency, the jungle seemed to tighten around him, every shadow sharpening into a potential threat as the snipers prepared to unleash another volley. He pressed the post into the soil, feeling the rifle settle into a position of unnatural stillness that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around him. The sergeant glanced in his direction with a mixture of suspicion and hope, but he said nothing, perhaps sensing that the moment for strict obedience had passed and the moment for survival had begun. Another shot cracked through the air, and a branch snapped loudly above Harlow's head, marking the precise trajectory of the nearest sniper. He inhaled slowly, allowing the stabilizer to distribute the tension in his arms as he angled the carbine upward toward the shifting shadows. This was no longer a theoretical trial or a private experiment. It was the first decisive moment of a battle that would soon stretch into a relentless hour, and every breath he took from this point forward would either inch them toward survival or condemn the platoon to collapse. With the ridge on the brink of breaking and the enemy tightening their noose from above, Harlow placed his cheek against the stock, steadied his breathing, and prepared to fire the shot that would mark the beginning of the most improbable hour of his life. The first shot broke the standoff with a clean, decisive crack that seemed to carve a tunnel of silence through the humid air, and for a moment Harlow wondered if he had imagined the faint thud that followed from somewhere high within the canopy. The stabilizer transmitted none of the jittering recoil that usually spoiled his upward aim, allowing the rifle to return smoothly to its resting position while his eyes searched for movement along the tangled branches overhead. A soft rustle confirmed that at least one sniper had fallen from his perch, and the platoon instinctively pressed closer to the ground as they realized the impossible had just happened. Someone had struck back against an enemy they previously couldn't even see. Before the Japanese could reposition, Harlow adjusted the carbine by only a fraction of an inch, guided less by clear shapes than by the subtle shifts of shadow that betrayed a sniper preparing to fire again. He inhaled through clenched teeth, letting the stabilizer bear the strain in his arms as he centered the sights on a narrow gap where a glint of metal flickered between two thick vines. The second round left the muzzle with a sharper tone, cutting cleanly through the foliage before a muted cry echoed above the ridge, confirming that the shot had found its mark. Two snipers down within seconds felt surreal, yet the stabilizer's unwavering steadiness anchored his focus, pushing aside disbelief and sharpening his instincts with an almost eerie clarity. The rest of the platoon remained frozen in their positions, too stunned to speak, but unwilling to break the fragile rhythm that was forming as Harlow continued his methodical assault. The snipers, realizing their advantage was slipping, attempted to scatter along the canopy, but their movements betrayed them in ways the trained eye could finally exploit. Every shift of weight or subtle sway of a branch created brief but significant windows of vulnerability, and Harlow learned quickly to anticipate those disturbances rather than react to them. With each slow breath, he aligned the carbine along the stabilizer, allowing gravity and leverage to guide the rifle with a precision no amount of formal training had ever provided. Minutes passed in a blur of controlled breathing, muzzle flashes, and falling leaves as Harlow worked through a pattern of scanning, adjusting, firing, and reacquiring targets that felt as natural as repairing a fence on a windy afternoon back home. The carbine's magazine changes occurred with quiet efficiency, each swap executed with a smooth familiarity born from countless hours of practice rather than adrenaline-fueled panic. Each successful shot boosted his confidence further, turning fear into momentum as the jungle canopy gradually shifted from enemy stronghold to contested battlefield. At some point, the snipers attempted to counter his assault by firing rapidly to break his concentration, but the stabilizer absorbed the tremors in his arms and prevented the rifle from drifting under sustained psychological pressure. He responded with measured, precise shots, each one aimed at the faintest silhouette or smallest flicker of movement that steadily dismantled the enemy's elevated firing line. The forest canopy, once alive with deadly intent, began to quiet as bodies slumped from branches or tumbled down the slope, dislodging showers of leaves that drifted lazily toward the ridge like green confetti marking improbable victories. The sergeant watched with an expression that hovered between disbelief and awe, whispering counts under his breath as each confirmed hit added to a tally that defied every expectation of what a single soldier, armed with a lightweight carbine, could accomplish. Even the radio man, still wrestling with static on the handset, paused occasionally to glance toward Harlow, unable to reconcile the calm rhythm of his shooting with the chaos that had engulfed them only moments earlier. The platoon felt the shift in momentum like a physical change in pressure, sensing the enemy's tightening grip slowly loosening as the elevated firing positions were eliminated one by one. By the time the engagement reached its 40th minute, Harlow's world had narrowed to nothing but breath, trigger, and shadow each element merging into a seamless cycle of action that left no room for doubt or hesitation. The stabilizer continued to bear the weight of the rifle, allowing him to push deeper into the fight with a precision that bordered on grace despite the mud and smoke that coated his uniform. When the final cluster of Japanese soldiers attempted to retreat to a secondary perch, he tracked their movement with steady, deliberate aim, firing a series of shots that broke their formation and forced them to abandon the ridge entirely. When the forest finally fell silent after nearly an hour of grueling tension, 46 enemy snipers and concealed infantry lay scattered among the branches and ravine slopes below. The platoon remained frozen for several seconds, their minds struggling to process the impossibility of what they had just witnessed. Only when the sergeant finally exhaled a shaky, uneven breath that cut through the quiet did anyone allow themselves to believe the nightmare had ended. Harlow lowered the carbine slowly, the stabilizer still pressed firmly into the earth.